Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So blessed day to wherever you are in the world. I hope my message finds you in the best of health and circumstance. I'm Dr. Imran Suddahazai, Head of the Education Studies here at the Markfield Institute of Higher Education. And I'm really honored today to be able to share with you, my dear colleagues, students and respected guests, the reflections upon my sort of personal, just getting my slideshow going, reflections upon my personal educational experience here at Markfield and why I believe we are, as Dr. Haroon has alluded to in the opening, ever so privileged and fortunate to be working within the intellectual qalb or heart of the Muslim community here in the UK. Before I introduce the theme of my discussion, I just want to quote from T.S. Eliot, whereby he observes poignantly that to know what we want in education, we must know what we want in general. We must derive our theory of education from our philosophy of life. Therefore, to know what we want in education, we must firstly know our sample of the populace that we are engaged with to decipher the theory of education, consequently, the philosophy of life. The students we engage with here at Markfield are not homogeneous in terms of personalities, characters, ethnicities, sectarian affiliations, etc. From one end of the spectrum, we have students whom are polyglots, polymaths, well-traveled, embodying the classical notion of the El Doran. Talibs traveling from place to learn, thus learning through the journeying experience, the El-Rihala that Sheikh Faisal so spoke about. On the other scale of the spectrum, we have students who have never left their towns, traveled or experienced anything outside their ordinary normal. And attending Markfield is a serious marker in their life journey and exposure. This then provides the justification, as if it were, to the discussion of our topic today, the Madrasa and Markfield, reflective praxis, and differing intellectual traditions. In essence, what this title implies is that I'm sharing my reflection upon my teaching practice of the MA and BA programs in Islamic education here at Markfield through very much an anecdotal, introspective approach. I will discuss primarily how the realization of the practical underpinning shaping the notion of education in Muslim civilizational history could help educators move students towards re-engaging with Muslim scholarship as a pragmatic and dynamic practice rather than simply a theoretical body of knowledge to preserve. Now, in defining the traditional Muslim seminary graduates, we are referring to students to have grounding in the traditional or the Ghazalian classification of the ilm al-naqliyah. In our living context, this entails that students have studied either all of or elements of the Dars al-Nizami curriculum, as derived from the educational traditions of the Indian subcontinent in this case. However, the contemporary promulgation upon these students, deciphered through a review of the literature, reveals that there is little acknowledgement of value placed upon their knowledge base and practical value to modern day society. The argument stems from the premise that the students who follow this dichotomous classification within traditional Muslim seminaries are innately imbued with this discriminatory, and parochial prejudice to knowledge and the world. Thereby, they are limited in their rationale and emotional intelligences. The educational systems that they embody don't really represent the Kantian notion of the cultivation of the luminous from within to interpret the phenomena outside. Instead, it represents a failure to engage with the modern world, leading to isolationist or extremist stances. However, speaking from a personal perspective, this overtly incessant need to measure and quantify the religiosity of people is questionable. If the notion of religiosity implies the deciphering of personal attitudes towards the belief in and practice of a specific faith system, then who decides what the appropriate levels are? What I would suggest from my experience is that instead of measuring how well fish can climb trees, we examine the students for who and what they are. Firstly, it is imperative that we understand the notion of the self or the nafs from the Islamic perspective so that we can understand its potential and purpose. The nafs itself can be conceived as a constant internal dialogue that unremittingly seeks to recreate itself through a personal narrative. This iterative reinterpretation of the self, either confirming or denying at each instance its beliefs about itself, is understood to be the process of identity formation. Thus, the question I ask is, what is the identity of the students or my students that I teach and engage with? To do this, it is imperative that we get to know each of the individuals or the selves or the nafses that sit before me. Each is a unique being and creation with its own story and narrative. his or her own story of narrative, informed by a faith or an iman system that formulates his character and personality, often known as shakhsiyah. What do I really find when I engage or deal with these people in my classroom? Students that are first and foremost civilized. What do I mean by that? For me, that entails the fact that they embody and demonstrate respect, humility, temperance, and faith, both in the classroom and outside. They have morals and ethics. I'm not aware of any cases, especially from my own tutor groups, that have entailed misogyny, sexual perversion, or other forms of violence or any form of profane or aggressive behavior. Secondly, they are dedicated and motivated to learn and develop. They are an asset to our learning environment and emotional and educational community. They possess the innate skills and have the learning experience to become the ideal type of educators for not only Muslim-only audiences, but the mainstream, as Sheikh Yasir Faghi pointed out earlier. Sharing our experiences then briefly here today, we can summarize our work really into 3 incremental approaches. Sorry, I should have pointed out the identity that most people want to assume, or we want them to assume, have that confidence. Okay, here we go. So the initial stage really comprises in what we would call the contextualization of knowledge. What do we mean by that? What we're saying really is that narrative states that Islam broke the shackles of oppression. That's what gives it its relevance. Muhammad SAW embodied it with his struggle against the Quraysh, a minority fringe actor taking on the might of society and its interests, against the symbolism of the conflict between Daud and Jalut, the powerful relevant against the powerless irrelevant. What we learn from this is in the first instance of his transformation was, or Muhammad Sallam's transformation that is for his empowerment. And now that empowerment had to be utilized to stand up for social justice against oppression, tyranny, iniquity, and transgression. In short, the haqq, the truth. The result of that struggle, literally and metaphorically, and in all its essence, was the resultant state of Medina. This didn't, however, mean that lessons and purpose of the education system suddenly changed so drastically that now all we are focused on is building armies and economic systems, akin to the underlining sort of functionist perspectives of today, because the foundation of the educational purpose was entrenched into the very psyche and hearts of the scholars which preceded them and went before, went after them thereof. Thus, the onus was to ensure, through the broad educational enterprise, that justice and equity became the intellectual and social capital of the Islamic civilizational endeavor. So I do have a bit of a cold there, so my throat's pretty dry. The purpose of education was to ensure parity while developing integrity. As Noel Feldman argues so convincingly, the scholars were the heirs to the prophets because only they who could counter the power structures and act as intermediaries between the state and the people. Examples to this effect include the conquering of the Persian city of Jundeshapur and the great protection and patronage afforded to the great academy there, leading to the development of the rational Greek sciences and their translations. The development of the science of jurisprudence and the establishment of the Nizamiyyah Madrasa system represents watershed moments in Islamic history in terms of the civilizational attitudes and approaches to knowledge and education. Students, therefore, are encouraged to utilize a variety of methods, including readings, online media, in-class tutorials, lectures, and group work to connect the lessons of the incipient moments of Islam as the revelation is unveiled upon Muhammad SAW, with regards to his struggle and within the socio-political context in which he lived, and the ethos of the educational purpose that then develops from there on. Okay, we can't have a disconnect in that point. And that's what we're trying to imbue into our students, this continuity. This example provides evidence and demonstrates potential for exploration and transformation, which is often associated with notions of the development of the self or nafs, which entails that the nafs is able to transcend its disposition by becoming more aware of its relationship to creation, itself, and of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The nafs or the self in transcending becomes more selfless in its existential behavior. So as it recognizes its subsistence and security, the rizq element are guaranteed by its creator. So the nafs becomes focused and principled as it cannot be corrupted by desire, and therefore becomes, as demonstrated by the Husna Hasana, the role model, Muhammad Sallallahu, to become empowered, as I mentioned before. Students are tasked with identifying the broad biographical sketch of the Prophet to identify the holistic nature of his humanity. Students demonstrate their understanding through essays and presentations. They recognize that as he now embodies the Khilafat fil earth purpose of man upon the earth, therefore he has been or was tasked with combating and confronting social iniquity in both thought and deed, thereby identifying the purpose of education from an Islamic worldview and lived perspective. The teacher-student model then becomes a divine model of education that has existed and continues to exist in all traditions and schools across the world, Islamic and non-Islamic. Students are introduced to a broad base of literature from the Islamic and non-Islamic traditions to highlight this point. Teaching becomes about developing relationships. The teacher becomes a surrogate parent of knowledge formation about the world, and so shapes the character and personality of his students or her students. A model that students could identify with as a result of their own educational experiences, once attending traditional seminaries. The notion of adab or education as ta'addub is discussed voluminously by Atlas and his student Van Daud Muhammad. And we explore this, for instance, along with other promulgations. This perspective, when applied then to the Prophet's proficiency as demonstrated through the empirical sources, presents a nuanced picture in terms of the accomplishment of the people the Prophet taught directly and or educated, and then subsequently influenced throughout Islamic history, Muslim or non-Muslim. He not only helped the people discover themselves, but to what to do with it. He demonstrated to them that the education implied that the developed self possessed the power to make change and transform not only themselves, but their communities and societies. So he empowered his followers, who empowered their fellows, and so forth. From a Paulo Freirian perspective, this will be breaking the chains of oppression, in this case referred to as Jahiliyyah. What is Jahiliyyah? Whereby man is in essence subject to or enslaved to other men and their ideals or ideas of themselves and their world and their experience of it. For example, for the relevance of most of our students, this could entail a case study examination of the Deoband institution to understand how its anti-colonial stance impacted the development or constriction of the Dars al-Nizami curriculum. And how Shah Abdulaziz Dalvi, the son of Shah Waliullah Dalvi, for instance, is rightly considered to be amongst the first of those who gave birth to the Indian freedom movement. So now students are equipped to relate and reconcile their faith-based knowledge with actual lived historical reality, which then allows them to derive practical educational lessons related to the contemporary situation in a sort of broad context. In order to achieve this, we use a range of comparative case studies across historical timeframes, regions, intra and inter-empire. For example, comparing the developments of learning institutes, such as the Al-Azhar in Cairo under the Fatimids, and the response by the Seljuk Vizier Nizam al-Mulk Abu Ali Hassan ibn al-Tusi in Baghdad to establish that golden Nizamiyyah system that we still look back at so romantically. Again, steeped in political power, social context. Another example that could entail the examination of the biographies of the great Imams of Sunni Islam. For example, Abu Hanifa was imprisoned and tortured on refusing the chief Qadi or judge position on several occasions, as was Imam Shafi later and Ibn Hanbal. And also there's tradition to their collaboration and studentship. They were students of each other, which reveals that these men who ultimately defined Islam through a legalistic framework were in their lived practice and experiences almost revolutionary and anti-authoritarian. While still engaging with the community, not maintaining isolationist stances, they engaged in collaborative practice and acting as imams or leaders of their communities in positions of both symbolic and actual leadership, based upon their authority as scholars and influence as men of character and deed. This explication of the historical realities that the students are already familiar with introduces the idea and notions on the culture of cross-collaboration and fertilization in the face of adversity and hostility from both majority and minority societal contexts during the early and later times. This is imperative for a sectarian audience to appreciate, so that it dispels the myths and divergencies introduced at later stages and allows for research and scholarly contributions to begin between Muslims of different affiliations. This will then equip the students to begin to address the criticism and critique which surrounds them. In this case, we utilize critical, pedagogical, and Socratic approaches to understand the critique and what is essentially informing us to it. This is not a defensive maneuver. We do not position ourselves to frame everything within a victimized or abused mentality, but understand why the argument has been made in the first place. For instance, many of our students engaging with the literature at a more analytical level feel a sense of aggrievement that the Orientalist and then later Muslim reformist literature identifies Imam Ghazali, amongst a few other causes, of course, to be directly responsible for the closing of doors to ijtihad and rationalism in the Islamic tradition. Thank you, the voice of reason there. Such as Ghazali's attack upon the philosophers through his tafut, the incoherence of the philosophers. Here, the onus is not to provide a direct answer to your sense of hurt, I suppose, to my students here, but to demonstrate through Socratic and reflective approaches supported by lessons on foundational philosophical and theological approaches to uncover what Ghazali actually does is tantamount to genius. Students discover through the guided independent study or our group research interactive teaching that Ghazali actually engages the philosophers on their own terrain by arguing in philosophical terms, methods and dialects to identify epistemological and therefore methodological failings in their approaches to philosophy and theology, thereby demonstrating its own prowess in the field and its possible reconciliation or use to substantiate and explore theological positions in relation to developing new methodological approaches. This discovery led students to further explore the criticism against Muslim historical veracities and develop responses based upon empirical and rational evidence. For instance, Ghazali was not the first, of course, to innovate in such fashion. Right from the earliest periods, we see in the compilation of the Quran, Huzayd Thabit, accredited by Azmi, to have developed the textual analysis method, whilst in the development of the hadith science effectively has led to the creation of the peer review process that is so venerated in modern day academia. Or Imam Shafi's development of the science of jurisprudence, which has impacted case-based study law in the UK, as some scholars have argued. And the list can go on and on. Of course, we are stuck for time here. Students are learning to appreciate then, by the end of their time here at Markfield, that methodological development was an innate part of the early and incipient Muslim civilization. Thereby, the call for reform or reevaluating education from the Islamic worldview perspective is not a new exercise. It's not a new exercise in the grand context of Muslim civilizational history. There appears to be an inbuilt mechanism in the very understanding of the deen of Islam, as opposed to the religion of Islam, to be a faith-based system which operates on a societal context. And we really cannot separate it from that point of view. And this is really what allows it to revive and cleanse the deviations from its essential message of Tawheed. So in conclusion then, I will say that my experience has thus far taught me that in order for us to begin a program that could once again generate the luminaries of the yesteryear and prepare the path for the mujaddids of tomorrow, inshallah, some are here today, we can no longer fractionalize upon Arabic terms derived from Quranic connotations as evidence for the totality of Islamic education. There has been until this moment no subject in Muslim history dedicated to the exclusive study of Islamic education. This is a modern day conception. Although there exist texts by such wondrous minds as Ibn Sa'nun, Ibn Jama'ah, Imam Zarnuji, etc., just to mention a few, that discuss educational matters and approaches, but only in terms of instruction or ta'lim. Education itself was enshrined within the totality of what constituted knowledge formation, dissemination and digestion, whether this was in the initial sufas of Medina or the cafes of Cordoba, libraries of Baghdad, the Bemiristans of Damascus, or the town squares and masajid of Cairo. Knowledge was gold, and the owners of gold knowledge, kings, showering their followers with morsels or piles, depending on the stature of the scholar or the partisanship of the crowd. Nevertheless, the worldview of education was not marginalized into a specialized body of science. Rather, it was, as T.S. Eliot remarked in the start there, a philosophy of life. In our discussion, we have discussed that through the adoption of a critically reflective style of pedagogy and student-centered approaches, students are able to engage and explore topics related to Islam through an objective and informed lens. Students recognize that there exists a crisis and dilemma in classical Muslim education, not in terms of its epistemological foundations or reformulations, but in terms of its practical applications. Furthermore, and more importantly, they have also understood that it consequentially and causally characterizes them as individuals imbuing or embodying that crisis, more importantly. So students are walking around. Yep, no worries, I'll just finish off here. So if I'm allowed to, I'll just finish off here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you, it's very kind of you. I'm just going to finish off here, so if you just start with this conclusion. Therefore, students, educators of the Islamic sciences in particular, whom we're addressing today, must take ownership for their educational traditions, methodologies and approaches, and come to the realization that the heritage of the educational system that they represent embodies a completely different purpose to what is being asked to address in the modern day age. This does not make the education irrelevant or outdated, but allows us to ask the question as to what is this knowledge actually informing us to do? And that, as we have briefly alluded to, represents the response to power and authority. It is the intellectual and social platform for Muslim scholars to ensure justice and equality in society and to challenge the iniquitous, unethical, immoral, and belligerent attitudes and practices of those with authority, influence, and subsequently institutional or legislative power. Last point, in conclusion, I suppose I would say, I would advise, again, Muslim educated students to adopt greater critical analytical approaches to not only educational content being taught, but the social, economic, and political policies that actually influence our daily lives. This must become an integral part of the educational process so that we can understand the shape and the value-based judgments that are being made upon our communities and our tradition. We can really get in-depth understanding as to where they come from and what the possible impacts of these will be. So the case at the moment, as we've seen it increasingly in continental Europe, is that Muslims who are not promoting or upholding a parochialized, I suppose, nationalistic or secularized neoliberal agenda are not only being marginalized, but essentially muted as institutions, as individuals. They're being shut down, and scholars speaking up are being so-called, what we call cancelled or whatever, with their reputations tarnished. So the onus is for us to recognize the contemporary landscape and develop responses which aim to empower us as individuals, communities, and as a society. This entails working, collaborating with all segments of society and people, building relationships, understanding so that Muslim students, educators become a de facto standard bearer for those around them. For the Muslim is not here simply to serve the Muslim, for the Rabb is Rabb al-Alameen, and the Muslim has a duty to serve humanity, and we are in a good place to do that, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for your attention. Thank you.